Somebody asked me the other day on Twitter, and I never got back to replying to them about what kind of literature that I read. And they said that they can't recall me mentioning the kind of literature that I read. And I was just thinking about my writing and how my writing is out of sync with reality. It's out of sync from the way that normal people interact with writing. And that's because when I first started writing, I didn't go to college for it. I just started reading and then writing and then reading and writing and reading and writing and reading and writing. I did that for several years. I produced a few, no, not a few, about 2.5 million words of me just like reading and writing and reading and writing and reading and writing. And then I just like, screw this. And I kind of stopped for a while, and I took a break. Took like a year off and stuff. And when I came back to writing, I could no longer read the kind of writing that I was writing. And what I had been writing was mythology and horror story and adventure story and fairy tale and confessional and diary and diatribe. And the only thing that I was able to really sink my teeth into was nonfiction stuff for whatever reason. And then when I went to college, when I was like 36, I went back to college and I tried to interact again with the kind of writing that I wanted to be writing. But I didn't really find that much courses that were teaching what I'd already read, so I tried to find things that I hadn't read, and I experienced literature a lot again, but then I wanted to learn about the kind of, I wanted to start to read the writing that was about writing, and specifically about the structure of writing, and really investigate how writing is built, starting from the very rudiments of writing, which are just, if you want to go all the way down, they're just individual sounds that are produced by, like this weird mechanism attached to this, some sort of sapien creature with minimal hair, depending on the sapien. Anyways, so going all the way down into what's called the semiotic roots of language, and there's stuff like really deep on the semiotic level, which is just the chopped up sounds, and then how those sounds eventually turn into this other level of writing that's called the semantic level of writing, and there's this syntactical level of writing, but that's just really technical. The stuff that I really wanted to get into was the writing that's built on top of the semantic writing, and the semantic writing is the level of sense making, or the level of language that encapsulates about a sentence, and everything that's built out of sentences. So semiotics is usually investigating what words are made out of, and how those words are arranged in a syntactical form, which means the grammatics of a language, of a lexeme. But then semantics starts talking about this other emergent property, loosely titled meaning or semantics, right? And I was interested in the stuff that's built on top of semantics, so I needed to study a little bit of the semiotics and a little bit more of the semantics in order to, be assured that when I enter into that supra-semantic level, I would have a firm foundation in the lower aspects of it. And it's an interesting question. I haven't really figured out this question. If that absolute abstract level of looking at language necessarily determines, let's say, the very rudimentary looking at language is just blocks of sounds arranged in certain patterns. If there is a translation, I know there's a translation, I don't know how it works, but it seems qualifiably different on the semiotic level, to look at language on the semiotic level, than it is to look at language on a semantic level, on the level of the sentence, and then another step up to look at language as it is used in the form specifically that we can just call fiction, right? And there's this off branch that before you get to fiction, there's this other thing called poetry. So I was interested in poetry and fiction because I wanted poetry to do certain things, because I still feel a lot of potency in the act of poetry, but I think that the poetry needs to serve something greater than the poetry to really unlock its fragrance and to really make it sing, right? So you need something larger than the level of the poetic level, which I would say there's the semantic level, and then one step up from the semantic level is the poetic level, and the poetic level is basically concerned with exploiting the symmetries in the language and playing with the differences between the semiotic level, how it sounds, and the symbolic level, what it means, right? So there's this two different types of sense that poetry seeks to play with, basically. And so the physical or the materialistic form of sense in this sense is the sense that is sonic. It's basically a oral language, but if you attach it to a face, then there's this whole other level. But that would still be everything that you're seeing right now. That's still the level of just basically hard-coded material facts, right? Like the way that I'm moving my face and the way that I'm moving this whole mechanism that's attached to my face. It forms a unit that I think you can examine on the semiotic level of sense, which would be just brute sense, how my voice feels in your ear, the tenor of my conversation, and the pace of the way that I'm arranging the words and then the sentences as well. And as well, we cannot forget the way that I'm wedding or adding to that by using my face. My face has a whole bunch of other information stacked on top of it, but there's still, you could reduce it all into the color of my skin and the beat of my eyes and just the physical manifestations. On top of that, there's this other form of sense. So there's the material sense, and then there's the sense that we would ascribe to as meaning, right? And the weird translation. And poetry is basically just involved in playing with those two levels. So we'll just call that Benjamin's radical view of poetry. Poetry is simply concerned with mixing sense with sense and seeing what happens when you cause those two to interrelate in a more determined manner. But higher than poetry, I firmly believe this, in a hierarchical way of viewing how this whole mechanism stands up, or how the work of art, eventually we'll get to the work of art, stands up as a work of literature, is on top of the poetry is the narrative. And the narrative is this whole other realm. Right? So you just have like the basic, you think of it as a kid. So the kid begins just like babbling and moving their face around and seeing the kinds of effects that the patterns that they make affect the patterns that they see, right? Like the tonality and stuff like that. That's just the semiotic level. On top of that, then they start to understand there's another person at the end of all these effects and causes and reactions that I am interrelating with, and that person can access me to different things both between us and things that aren't between us, such as what is in me and what is in you, right? But it all interacts between these basic rudimentary interactions that you can think of as basically being referent, right? So that the kid learns to master all this stuff that they're doing with their mouth, and they're hearing with their ears, and that they're seeing with their eyes and projecting with their face. It all has a how was I just about to say it? It all has a it all takes on importance insofar as it causes a change in their environment, right? Just a rudimentary change, and then on top of that change, they eventually start to discover that like the change is modulated by these verbal cues, right? It's just this crazy thing. You can totally trip out on that. But as the child grows, they start to become aware of more and more types of meaning, like beyond just that rudimentary referential field of two selves interacting and getting what they need from one another, whether the adult wants silence and the kid wants food, right? And then they negotiate that through these verbal signals. On top of that, or beyond that referential sense, is the sense of speaking about internality, or speaking about what happened to me, speaking about the past, speaking about what you did, speaking about what you will do, right? So language begins to extend into this higher order realm of time, right? And that time is constructed of the past and the present and the future, which is totally freaking trippy. But what ties that all together, what makes all of that make sense, is that there's a consistency between that which is the past. There's a quantifiable difference, or there's a qualifiable difference of what is the past, and that's signified by the language, speaking in past tense. And then there's a qualifiable difference of this, and once we get of the present, that is, and once we get enough experience in the past and the present, we start to expect the future. And actually, it's not just our knowledge of that, but our entire, all of our passions and all of our energies, all of that which constitutes our lower forms is directed towards the future. And by that I mean on the very genomic level, Everything that we are built of has come from the past and is only survived into the future by being aimed at it, and aimed at it on a very rudimentary physical level, but also on the level of survival and so on until we get into the higher forms of social constructs and stuff. But basically, I'm tying this to Darwinism, that everything that we are created of is created of that which sustains ourselves into the future. But on top of that, we start to develop these higher capacities of memory, and all of that is rooted and mediated and confirmed by language, by us talking to one another and agreeing that something did happen, right? And that's why that's where the capacity to lie develops, in the ability to variate the past, because we're constantly aimed towards the future, and we're aimed towards the future because our parents, all of our ancestors, were able to think of ways to interact with the future that would perpetuate them into the future. And all that stuff it's hard-coded into us up to a certain level. And then but we'll get up to there. So once the child, the consciousness, let's say, or once the child starts to extend into the realm of the past and the present and the future, not only lies come to being, not only memory comes to being, but this other thing called story. There's this particular way of using language, and it's all built out of lexemes and phonemes and all this. It's all material, and it's all semantics. It's all just sentences, and it's reference, but it's reference not to something that's between us, but to something that's over there, something that's outside of the present, right? But it's still constructed in such a fashion that it draws upon our experience of the present and variates it in a novel fashion. Fiction, one way of thinking about fiction is the way of referring to something that is created in the act of referring to it. So a fiction is a special way of using language that does not relate directly to, let's just say, those pots over there, or those trees behind me, or even you, who doesn't exist in my present, but we collapse all that on to pretending that I'm actually talking to somebody. It's another thing that we overlook. But on top of all that referential language, the capacity to refer is perverted, let's say, in a certain way in fiction, so that it doesn't refer to the here and now, to the this and that, but to this and that, to that and this, to that other now, to that other then, to that other he, to that other him or her, or so on. We start to construct novel ways of using language that start to create, to get to my point, to start to create ways of making meaning that are constructed out of larger constructs, that are built not out of sentences, just as sentences aren't necessarily built out of the physical act of speaking them. They're relating something higher than just the physical act of speaking them, but as well the sentences that build up into things in story, the things that the sentences create are not reducible to sentences, such as this thing called a character, right? A character is not reducible to sentences. It's a higher order entity. It's referred to by words, by a name, let's say Achilles, and then Achilles is related to a past, a present, and the future. And in that past and present and future is this postulated realm of event that we can just think of as time and space, and other hims and other hers, and then the larger structures that are modeled on the structures that we interact with in our here and now, in my me and your you, and our city and our country and this porch, right? So it's all built on that, but it's lifted up into a postulated there-ness that is sustained by our memory, working in conjunction with our imagination, and solidified into the present by our attention. Right? That's the basic thing. One more thing I'm going to leave you with, this random note on what fiction is made out of. Coleridge, who loved pot and is a wonderful poet and totally insane thinker. He was a romantic. He was a friend of Woodsworth. Coleridge said, he made this postulate about fiction being the willing suspension of disbelief. So when you interact with fiction, you're doing so by suspending your disbelief. And I think that's clever, but it's the opposite. It's diametrically opposed to the truth. The truth of fiction is, when we experience fiction, it is a willful investment of our belief. It is a positive postulating, is going along with accepting the author's tale as if it were true, and then extending our belief, which is just concretized or coagulated attention, into that fictional construct. Yeah, and then maybe if this made any sort of sense, I'll post what I mean by different sorts of genres within fiction, because on top of that semantic level of fiction, right, that way of making sense that's composed out of characters and various characters in various places under the duress of various circumstances, right, that's the sentence structure or the grammatics of a narrative, different ways of articulating those key aspects of fiction, which it would be story, time, and place, and circumstance. Certain ways of doing that create this a whole nother higher level of sense making called genres, and there's a interesting way of plugging this whole way of looking about literature as a construct, as a language construct, that translates onto mapping what a genre is, and mapping it in a way that one can exploit it by understanding the sort of sense that it is prone to making, and then playing with that sense making. Instead of just not doing clipping in a cat video, I'll just show you the cat. And I can't zoom on this side of the camera, but I think he's eating a mouse. There's a lot of critters out here, so I only feel kind of bad when they catch them. I don't like them when they bring it inside and then it dies, and then we have flies. Yeah, summertime cat family is kind of weird, smelly. Good night.